All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for carving out 30 to 40 minutes from your day to join us here for the Great Windows 7 Migration Webinar, A Path to Success. This is a very exciting webinar for us for a number of reasons. Because of kind of the way that this has really boiled up through 2019, this is definitely something on a lot of our minds. So, very much something that we have kind of been keeping tabs on for about 6 months here, and we're really excited to bring this forward as both a strategic idea, but also kind of a tactical execution blueprint. So joining me here today, I am Garrett. Joining me is, of course, Dean Hager, CEO of Jamf. And Dean, this is not something that is brand new to you. You've very much seen the evolution of the industry over your career.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks, Garrett, for having me here, and thanks to everybody out there for joining us. This has been a topic for a long, long time in the industry, which operating system and how to move forward with most recent releases. So it's a fun topic to take on today.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot to dive into here. Speaking of an agenda, this is how the topic will break down here today. We'll take a look back, of course, a look forward. We do have some calls to action to empower you through choice and some next step resources at the very end. The final thing I would say is we have plenty of time on the back end for Q&A live here with Dean on the call. So feel free to make liberal use of that WebEx Q&A panel throughout the discussion. Do it in real time. That will be logged right there. And on the back end, I'll jump back over to WebEx and we can take those Q&A questions as long as that takes. We've got plenty of time booked here on our end, and as long as you're able to join us on your end there as well. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. And the first thing that I want to do is extend a special welcome to anyone on the call that is joining us for the first time. If you're not part of the Jamf family yet, or you are, and this is your very first webinar, welcome here today. And again, thank you for carving out some time. And again, if you are brand new and you're just dipping your toes in the water of managing your devices, of finding enterprise-grade solutions, I want to throw this splash screen up. And Dean, this is something that you said back at our user conference in the fall, that the spirit of that commercial is really what drives us here. There is no step 3, and we really see this throughout the company, right?
Yeah, there was a commercial back in the 90s on how to connect your Mac to the internet. And the end of it, of course, was there's no step 3, talking about how simple it was. And we've adopted that phrase for a number of years. In fact, my very first day at work here at Jamf, instead of meeting with IT to collect my Mac, I walked into my office and it was sitting in a shrink wrap box with a Post-it note on it that's hand scribbled on it was step 1, open the box, step 2, power on, step 3, there is no step 3. So no step 3 has become our mantra around here, and it's possible really only with Apple, and we're proud to try and make that true for all of our customers who trust us to manage their devices.
You know, and I think for a lot of the grizzled veterans on the call, we look at this slide and we're kind of nodding our head saying, yes, the reality of zero-touch deployment, I think really rises to this level. And again, if you're brand new, this is the vision that Jamf is chasing. So when a colleague or your supervisor, somebody else in the company says, I've never heard of this Jamf company, tell me what they're about, this is what we're about. You just heard it from Dean from the very top of the organization. I can't tell you how often this comes up. From the very top to everybody else globally at Jamf, this is very much something that we chase every day. So to dive in here, what I'd like to do is begin with looking back at the Windows footprint in the enterprise. This is obviously a very big deal. It has been for years and, in fact, for decades. Windows through the years is not something I need to preach to you on, Dean, because you've seen this firsthand. It has long been the dominant platform in the enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at this list and I get a kick out of it because I graduated from high school in 1985. And, I really didn't know what Windows was at the time. I was using an Apple IIe computer. And then I went on to college, where I was in 87, and I used a Mac. But in 1990, when I entered the workforce, actually at IBM, is where I began my career as an operating systems programmer. That's when I first had exposure to Windows. And I became a Windows user then for the next 20 years of my career.
And I think for a lot of us, we look back and we think of those different kind of guideposts and touch points over our career, whether it's, to your point, starting a new job, maybe entering the workforce for the first time, adopting a new Windows operating system at home. We've seen a number of these things change over the years. And what's really shocking to me anyway is looking at this timeline and realizing, Windows 7 already a decade old, which kind of blows my mind. That was such a big release and so widely adopted when that was released. And then Windows 10, the current version of Windows, already 4 years old. It's really amazing how quickly things cycle, both in the industry at large, but specifically within enterprise IT. And Dean, of course, what we're here to talk about today is really the dominance of Windows 7 and what we do now that that's changing. We have a pretty mind-blowing stat, I think. 36% of all Windows users in the enterprise use Windows 7, which in and of itself is massive penetration for that operating system. When we drive this down to the user level, it equates to more than 100 million users deployed globally leveraging this platform. It's truly massive.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, these 100 million users are just within the enterprise, within organizations, not even considering consumer usage. What blew me away about your comments on Windows 7 is I already mentioned that for the first 20 years of my career, I was a Windows user. Well, for the last 10 years, and yes, that means I've been in the high tech for 30 years. For the last 10 years, I've been a Mac user, which means, amazingly, I was a Windows 7 user because it's been out for 10 years now. So the fact that there are still so many Windows 7 users out there really says two things. One, it clearly was a heavily adopted operating system, which means it was probably, and it was, a very good operating system. But also, people generally move very slowly off of highly adopted Windows releases. Now, in Mac land, where I've been for the last 10 years, that's not true. I mean, my Mac and most Macs get upgraded every single year when the new operating system comes out.
Well, it's a really interesting point, and I think unless you live inside of a very special bubble where you've only touched one platform, almost everyone on this call can relate to that at some point in our lives or in our careers, we've experienced either a different version of an operating system or an entirely different OS entirely, a different OS entirely. And I still think back, this was maybe 8 or 10 years ago now when I made that switch from the Windows side to adopting that first Apple machine. It was a Mac. And I think about kind of that transition that you go through. Even as somebody that is very tech savvy, even working in IT, it's still a change. And in many ways, it's still a challenge for that user. So this is definitely something on a global scale. We look at 100 million Windows 7 devices. That in many ways equates to tens of millions, if not 100 million individuals that really are facing this now with that January 2020 deadline coming up. And we'll touch on that in just a minute when Windows 7 extended support hits end of life. What I want to do first, though, is, Dean, you've got this great story about how something is not urgent until it is. We were kind of brainstorming, and you told the story about your cabin. Maybe kind of walk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. The story that I told, which is really the inspiration behind this lightning bolt that you see, is for years, my wife and I had a small cabin in Wisconsin that we would go vacation at. And it was just a little rundown cabin. And for years, we wanted to renovate it. And we always put it off because we didn't want to spend the money. And one day we showed up and there was a tree laying on top of it. And it was because a lightning struck a tree in the front yard. And at first, our reaction was quite negative. Oh, my goodness, we have this damaged cabin. But we went immediately to opportunity. And those renovations that we had wanted to do for so long, heck, now we were required to spend money because there was a tree laying on our cabin. So why not treat it as an opportunity to have something better than what we had before? And so it actually ended up in a positive for us, especially as we were able to get a little bit of insurance money.
Yeah, I like the story for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is, of course, we've got a headquarters here in the Midwest in the United States. And, if you're tuning in around the country or around the world, you might not realize how many folks have cabins here in the Midwest. It is endemic, but that story really resonates for anybody that I think has experienced the glory of cabin life. So, as we look at this, though, we kind of think about the end of Windows 7 as this singular event, extended support, ends in January 2020. That's coming up very quickly, when in reality, we take a look back, there were 3 lightning strikes in this series of kind of the sea change that's happening. The first was 2013, the end of standard support for Windows 7. For a lot of folks, this was the wake-up call to kind of realize that despite its heavy adoption, Windows 7 is still an operating system. Just like every other operating system throughout history, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, kind of like a great book, right? And I think with this first lightning strike in 2013, that light bulb went on and we all realized there will be an end to Windows 7, and we should start thinking about how to prepare for that and how to make that transition, to your point, Dean, an opportunity, not a challenge or a pain point. Well, then again in 2015, the end of Service Pack 1 support. Again, this is reinforcing this is changing and we need to be ready to migrate away and make a change. So January 14th, 2020, this is the big one, the end of extended support. For a lot of people on the call here, Dean, we maybe saw this take place in 2013, again in 2015, but January 14th, 2020, if you're a security-conscious individual with the end of extended support, that's really the big lightning strike of the 3, right?
Yeah, that's January 14th, 2020 is the proverbial tree is laying on your cabin. It's time to do something. You need to do something. Even if it means staying on Windows 7, that is an investment choice. Moving to Windows 10 is an investment choice. Doing something maybe a little bit more special is an investment choice. But no matter what, you have one. The time is here.
You know, and again, if you're a Jamf veteran and you've been in the ecosystem for a couple of years now, you've heard our story about conditional access, a partnership, a deep integration with Microsoft Intune that really enables Mac alongside Windows. That is a partnership, to your point, Dean, that opens up more options than ever before. Keep investing in Windows 7. Make that investment to upgrade to Windows 10. Make a different kind of investment to empower your users with the device and operating system they might want or desire. We'll dive into those options in just a minute here. What I want to first do, though, is take a look at what does end of life mean. We toss this around in different parts of IT in a number of different contexts, but here, Microsoft no longer required to provide critical security updates for 1, to support operating system updates for 2, and then kind of looking to the future beyond January 2020, we're talking a paid engagement. And I think for a lot of us, we deal with budget. We have very real constraints on what we can accomplish in any given calendar year or fiscal year. And for us, this is that tree limb on the cabin. We've got money in budget on the line, right? And it's time to kind of take a hard look at how we make those assets work for us. And, you know, Dean, you think back over that long career, there have been a number of stops along the way where you say, well, technology change is coming. It's going to require budget. Maybe we take a broader look rather than immediately do what we thought we would do right off the bat.
Yeah, absolutely. For most, I'm pretty sure what they're thinking. Windows 7 is coming to end of life, so therefore you must move to Windows 10. That's just the natural progression. But a lot has changed since 2009 when Windows 7 first came out, not only from an application usage perspective and from a hardware perspective, but also just what IT is within an enterprise. And you have an opportunity to do something a little bit different for your users that may not have been available to you back in 2009. And we're encouraging you to step back and take a look at those opportunities.
It's funny even to look at our own product set, right, and to take a step back in that time machine 10 years. So much has changed at Jamf and so much has changed in the industry at large. And it really touches on why this is a significant change. I've got 3 big things here that really drive this home. Why is this a big market-moving change that we need to pay attention to? First of all, 100 million devices around the world deployed in enterprise business everywhere, right? This is a massive population of devices. Number 2, it's coming fast. For most of us in enterprise IT, we look at things in cycles of years. So we're planning for 2020, 2021, 2022, and even beyond, really trying to get our arms around a healthy refresh cycle. But this is coming up fast. And I think 2013 and 2015, if those were the spark, this is where that fire is burning very hot now, and we have 9 months to make a change, put together a plan, and get ready. The final thing I would say is 2019 is building on a number of years that kind of successively built up a security-conscious mindset for a lot of us. Security, Dean, of course, kind of a constant through your career in the industry, through a lot of our careers, but this seems to be something unique. It's more prevalent than ever, and it really does tie to the devices that we put in people's hands.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, especially with cloud computing, the network is sort of gone. Everything is in the cloud, or most things are today. So therefore, your identity, one, and your device, two, are the most important security and safety perimeters that you have for your enterprise. So therefore, you want to make sure that your device, the operating system, and the applications are all secure. And we well know the older an operating system gets, the more threats there are out there to it. In addition, the older the operating system is, more than likely the older the applications are as well. And that poses additional security risks. So keeping your software modern and up-to-date and upgraded is one of the best things you can do to sort of fend off security risks.
Yeah, certainly something that we've seen for decades now, right? Ever since computing really made its entrance into the enterprise, I think we've been thinking this way, but with this change in particular, with 100 million plus devices affected, this is mammoth, and it really is the true definition of a sea change. So as we wrap our arms around this and think about what I think is the core of this challenge, how do we respond? We're thinking at scale, and we're thinking at depth. And really, we look ahead. That January marker is that proverbial tree limb on the cabin. It's really the beginning of a new life cycle within the enterprise. And we have two paths ahead. And I think when we say this, Dean, we're coming, of course, from a very specific view. We exclusively have supported the Apple ecosystem for 17 years. And the kind of the easy thing to jump to is, well, they're talking about Microsoft and Windows. And they want, from the Jamf perspective, to see less Windows machines and more Macs, right? And maybe see all of them go to Mac. Is that kind of where we're coming from, or no?
It is not. Actually, you're right. Most people would think that we're here saying you could follow one of two paths, the Apple path or the Microsoft path. And the fact is, we don't necessarily think that either of those paths is the right path. We think there's a third path that is very interesting and will actually be a part of redefining how IT is done. With that said, ultimately, we don't want a user using either of these operating systems if they don't want to use it. In other words, that third path is the user preference path. If they prefer a Mac, let the user use a Mac. If they prefer Windows, let the user use Windows. Ultimately, we don't want anybody, even though we're Apple fans here at Jamf, we don't want anybody that doesn't want to use a Mac to be forced to use a Mac. You're almost guaranteed to have an unsatisfied user.
You know, and it's what I really love about this story that we're telling here today. I think the gut reaction is, well, it's Mac or it's Windows. I need to choose one. This is coming fast. It's stressful. It's intense. And we really feel that pressure to make a change, to do an upgrade, to have a paid engagement, or to switch systems. And really what you're touching on cuts to the heart of not only this story, but the Jamf story, Dean, and it's putting users at the center of software. And that's the elevated role of IT. You touched on this a minute ago, but if we really believe that IT is transforming and it's no longer just a function of kind of being a service desk for hardware and for software, that it's elevating into a recruiting tool, a retention tool, a productivity tool, well, we've got a completely different story on our hands, and I think that's what we'll see here today. So let's look through a sample blueprint, very basic blueprint of what it looks like to A, migrate to Mac, and then we'll look at the Windows side as well. In fairness, we'll kind of go down both of these different paths and journey with the IT user. So you are an admin of an MDM tool, and you think, well, the first thing I need to kind of jump over, the first hurdle I'll encounter is cost, right? And on the Mac side, we often hear about the cost of the device, and that's kind of first and foremost in a lot of our minds. The second thing, of course, is applications. We're using apps today. They power a lot of our enterprise workflows. I'm worried maybe as that IT admin, maybe as that director or senior level person responsible for this, that by offering a different device, a different ecosystem, there might be a gap there. There might be breakage between what we have and what we could have on a different system. And the final thing, the real core set of challenges here is rounded out always with security. To my point earlier, this has been a constant for years, but I don't think it has ever been as acute as it is right now. And now, Dean, we get through those core three. We're to the fun stuff. It's user preference, it's unique benefits, and really formulating that adoption. But those core three challenges, they're very real in a lot of our minds, right? Day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. And as an IT person, what you really want is you want to be able to go through a journey, and when you're through it, look back and be happy that you went through it. And one of the things that we have found as we've been working with organizations that choose to bring the Mac into the workplace is I've never heard an organization say, oh, I rue the day that I did that. I regret that. Because generally speaking, we have seen the things that you see on the right of your screen, that the users are delighted with the technology that they've been provided. So as an IT person, you usually rejoice in the fact that your users are so delighted. So generally speaking, if you have the energy to go through each of these hurdles, there is reward waiting on the other side.
I think it's a really important reminder, and we look at both of these blueprints here today on this webinar as kind of samples, right? They're a tactical template for how we could attack this. But what I love about Jamf is it's not just migrate to the Mac, you'll have a better experience, your users will have a better experience. It's give choice, and that is a broader and I think game-changing message because we're not advocating leaving behind what has worked, and in many cases has worked for decades. We'll take a look here at the Windows 10 kind of sample blueprint. What we'll find is we're crossing the same kind of hurdles with upgrading to Windows 10 that we crossed just a moment ago with migrating to Mac. It's a cost thing because of that paid upgrade. Applications, never quite the same from OS to OS, as you well know, Dean, and security always on our mind. Then we get to implementation.
Yeah, and that cost is not just, again, the Windows 10 now actually costs money to upgrade to it. In addition to that, if you have an old PC that is running Windows 7, there's not a guarantee that Windows 10 is going to run on that just fine, or the applications that you're going to need with Windows 10 are going to run just fine. So you may end up looking at software costs, you may end up looking at hardware costs, and of course, additional security. So amazingly, the very same hurdles that you're going to go through to move to Mac or to introduce Mac within your organization are the same exact considerations that you're going to look at it by moving to Windows 10.
I think it's a great point. And on this slide, what we're really trying to demonstrate is whether you're going through an upgrade path or a migration path, adopting something brand new as far as a new vendor, right? Moving to Mac or bringing Mac in for the very first time, or making that migration from Windows 7 to Windows 10. These core challenges are very much still the same. Two separate paths, right? The Apple path, the Windows path, but they share bullets 1, 2, and 3. And it's so critical to remember that because whether we're going to the left, to the right, or on that third path, that user-centric journey, those are the same. The key though, Dean, and I think we talk about this a lot at Jamf, is the end result is very different. And we're not just talking January 2020, we're talking the life cycle of those devices.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you're going to go through the journey, and if no matter what, like I said, you're either going to stay on Windows 7, you're going to go to Windows 10, or you're going to introduce Mac within the organization. When you're through the journey, you want to look back at the race that you just ran and know that you ran the right race. Be happy with what you did and have your users be happy with it. And the opportunity that you have presented at you right now, since those Windows 7 users are going to go somewhere, by bringing them into the process and seeing what their preference is, when you reach that far green box on the right, you'll have, ideally, a delighted set of users behind you. And why wouldn't they be if they were brought into the process in the first place?
And kind of up next is the question of, well, maybe I buy into the similar paths, different ends. Maybe I'm seeing beyond January 2020, but what's my first step? And that is a very challenging place to be because you have something that you know, and again, to your point earlier, the tree limb is on the cabin, you must make a move. And anywhere you go outside of that existing environment is an unknown. Whether it's a straight upgrade, whether it's bringing in Mac to your organization for the first time, these are unknowns, and it can be a little tenuous. So we want to walk through what it looks like to empower your end users through choice. And again, we're thinking about this both as IT experts, but also as IT experts that serve the end user with that elevated role of IT as a recruitment tool, as a retention tool, and so forth. And I love this quote. This was something that came out of a Jamf event a couple of months ago. But, when did somebody ever say, I'm the most productive and happy when using a device I didn't choose, with an operating system I don't know, on hardware that I don't prefer? And I think the answer we should all know is never, right? Nobody comes to work and says something like this.
Yeah, it's true for computers. And frankly, it's true for every type of tool I can think of. We're in the middle of baseball season or at the beginning of baseball season. Batters want their own bats. They want their own gloves. They all perform essentially the same function, but they want to use something and they believe that they're most productive with theirs. If you go out to your garage to do a chore, you're going to choose the tool that you are most familiar with that can get the job done. If somebody gives you something you've never used before, you're simply not going to be as productive on it. So this quote and the fact that nobody says it, the same is true for in all walks of life, most certainly for computers and operating systems.
Yeah, and I can think of a number of home projects that have become 2 or 3 times as expensive as intended to be because I borrowed a tool from a friend, kind of assumed I could wing it. Turns out I can't, and pretty soon I'm looking at something very similar to this. So I end up on YouTube trying to retroactively educate myself about how to use that tool. To your point, Dean, very much the same experience in IT. I want to burn through a couple of stats here, and then Dean, you're going to give us some context on this that I think is so critical. We did a survey 24 months ago now that really just looked at what is the impact of IT today. If modern IT is changing, what does that change look like? Well, 77% of respondents said they would choose to work or stay at a company that offers choice, which to me is just mind-blowing. That is a game-changing stat that, again, elevates the role of IT. We then followed up and asked, well, what's the impact on that employee experience? If you would choose an employer or stay at an employer, that's recruitment, that's retention, what's the end result? More productive. By and large, the number one response. More creative, more collaborative, and then again reinforcing they are more proud of where they work. And finally, 72%, when given the choice, would choose Mac over PC. And I think these stats, Dean, are a little mind-blowing for a lot of folks. You might look at this with a skeptical eye, right?
Yeah, I've quoted that 77% stat before of people saying that they would choose to stay or leave an organization based on technology choice. And I've been challenged on it saying, will people really do that? And my response to that has been, does it really matter? They think that they would do it or they would like to do it. They responded that they would want to make an employment decision based on technology choice. And to an IT team, doesn't that matter? If our users are actually saying, I would really like to make an employment decision based on this ability to be able to make my own choice. Well, we should try and feed that. If they believe, 70% believe that they're more productive on that device, don't we want our employees, our team members to actually believe that every day as they're using the device that ends up being their number one interface or experience into their work life?
It's a great point. The survey was third party. This was outside of Jamf, so we didn't, kind of bake these numbers ourselves in the Jamf oven. This is very much something that came market wide. And at least speaking for myself, you see something above 70%. That's more than significant. That is a silent majority for a lot of companies. And, even if the number is different in your enterprise, this isn't 70, it's 50% would choose Mac. Even if it's 30%, that is a third of the workforce that we're talking about that could be better served if offered that device choice. And, I can think of almost no one better to illustrate that point than Martin Lang. Martin is very intelligent, very articulate. I loved having him back on the JNUC stage at our user conference last fall, where he said people expect they'll be able to use a Mac. And Dean, you've talked about this in many contexts before, but really the key word here is expect, right?
Yeah. The largest percentage of the workforce today is millennials. And millennials, believe it or not, believe that they should have a voice and a choice within the workforce. And they're right. The operative word here is expect, because the millennials that are coming within the workforce don't think that they're going to get mandated to use something that they don't know. They actually expect to be able to use a Mac, and in some cases, it's all they've used their entire lives. So why would we not want to support that choice and where they feel most powerful?
It's a really great point. And, having Martin, a vice president at SAP, on the stage talking through this, he actually brought a colleague of his with a young new hire that he live in person provisioned an iPhone, I believe it was, directly to this young woman. It was really incredible. In about 60 seconds, she was up and running. Very fun to see. The thing I want to touch on here to kind of round out this story is a case study, Apple at IBM. We're going to keep this brief because we have a lot of resources at jamf.com around this story, but Fletcher Previn, I think, probably the pinnacle of how you bring Mac into an enterprise and make it efficient and effective. So you look at this quote, we're deploying more Macs every month, but, and here's the key, not requiring more help staff to support these users. We talk about things like creativity, Dean. We talk about being proud of where you work. At the end of the day, Fletcher, CIO at IBM, was able to tie this back to headcount, and I think that is a true game changer.
Yeah, IBM deployed and has deployed over 100,000 Mac. And as you see from Fletcher, able to do it without requiring more help. Well, how is that possible? Well, when you configure the Macs to deploy, zero-touch deploy is what we call it, where you can just drop ship the device straight to the employee, and they're able to set it up on their own at first power up. And to quote one of Fletcher's statistics, that only 5% of Mac users were calling the help desk. And that was far, far less than PC users. And he threw that quote out there. I remember I ended up tweeting it one day, and somebody tweeted me back and said, "Oh, but Dean, the reason that they're not calling IT isn't because the Mac is a better machine. It's because they're so familiar with it. They are able to choose it. They're able to solve their own problems." And I wanted to tweet back, yeah, that's the idea. If you let somebody use the machine, the technology that they are most familiar with, are most passionate on, feel most powerful with, they're going to need somebody else to help them far, far less. That's what IBM's found. That's why they've been able to deploy Mac side by side with Windows and actually not require more help to do it.
Love the story, and Fletcher, I think, better than anyone else, really drives this home with data. He's just a very data-driven person. So head to jamf.com, do a search there for Fletcher Previn or for IBM. You'll see the case study there. Plenty more resourcing around that if that story is meaningful to you. The final thing I really want to touch on from a standpoint of Mac alongside Windows is something you might not expect to see on a Jamf webinar. I mentioned earlier 17 years at this company of exclusively supporting Apple. So now we look in the field, Jamf alongside Microsoft with technology called conditional access. It really allows and better empowers Mac to exist and succeed in those organizations that already have, we'll go back a slide there, that already have those Windows machines. Brad Anderson, of course, just a dynamic speaker, a very magnetic person that really understands this industry at a deep level. Dean, of course, you on stage with him at JNUC. With Microsoft and Jamf, organizations can consolidate endpoint management, of course, leveraging Microsoft Intune there and Jamf, and empower macOS users. And that's really the goal we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I can't say this strong enough because sometimes people... Sometimes we misstate ourselves, and our Mac fandom comes across as we just believe everybody should use a Mac. Once again, we are actually pro-Microsoft, and we're even pro-Microsoft Windows. If a user wants to use a Windows device, my goodness, let them use it because that's where they feel most powerful. But Microsoft, one of the reasons I'm such a big fan of that organization is they've done a brilliant job of redefining themselves into really a cloud solutions company in the last few years. And so what we believe our job is at Jamf is to make the Apple experience match that legendary focus on the individual that Apple has had for years, but to provide those individuals with an Apple experience within a Microsoft enterprise. And by Microsoft enterprise, I mean an Azure AD, Office 365 Cloud Solutions Enterprise, sitting right side by side, a Mac user and a Windows user, both who chose the technology that they wanted to use.
Well, it certainly is a powerful vision, and when we first talk about the two paths, I think again we assume it's one or the other. This is a binary choice, but really we start to think more deeply about user empowerment, and it's Mac alongside Windows. It's employee choice, and it's really empowering that user to use the tools they feel make them most productive for the good of the organization. We have a few next steps here that I'd like to touch on. And first thing I would say is if you're brand new and you're taking your first step into adopting choice, and this is feeling like maybe a little tenuous, head over to this URL and check out the Employee Choice Program's ebook. This is a great way to wrap your arms around for the very first time what it means to empower users with the devices that they are most comfortable with. And again, touching on that theme from earlier of being a grizzled veteran, if you've been in the Jamf ecosystem, if you've come to JNUC, if you've been on our webinars, you've seen this before. We have a brand new resource, a brand new ebook, Modern Enterprise Migration, that you can again find on that URL. Check it out. It's available right now. And again, it's a great way just to look ahead at Windows 10 or Mac, or, like we're saying here, both. Dean, thank you for joining us here, and thank you to everyone on the far side. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are around the globe. Take care.